I'd like to welcome you to our final presentation of the year of our Works in Progress by the Research Associates of the Women's Studies and Religion program. I'm Joan Branham. I'm filling in for Ann Browdy, who is on sabbatical, her last stretch of her sabbatical this year. And I also just want to mention we have sitting up here on our table to create in some ways a bridge from today to next year. We have the list of the new research associates who will be coming next year, an incredible group of scholars in a series of different traditions, one working in Native American traditions, Hindu tradition, a Buddhist scholar, African American, and another theologian working in the Catholic tradition. So a wide spectrum of projects for next year, and we will definitely look forward to that. Today, I'm happy to introduce to you Miryam Segal, who is assistant professor in comparative literature and Jewish studies at Indiana University, where she teaches courses in poetry, gender, and literature, midrash, modern Hebrew literature, and literary theory. Miryam earned her doctorate in comparative literature from the University of California, Berkeley, her bachelor's degree here from Harvard College, and before arriving in Indiana, she was a visiting scholar at Tel Aviv University. Miryam has a forthcoming book coming out this December. I just got the news today, and it is with Indiana University Press. It's called Accent: The Poetics and Politics of a New Sound in Hebrew Poetry. And in this book, she analyzes the political and literary ramifications of an accent shift in poetic Hebrew in the 1920s. But this year, Miryam has been working on another project, her next book project, called Women and Religion in Hebrew Poetry. And this is a study that focuses on Hebrew and Israeli poetry by women and the ways it has challenged and shaped the nation's relationship to both women and religion in pre-state Palestine and Israel. So I think we're going to hear more about that today in her talk, which is entitled Gender and Authorship in Hebrew Poetry, Scripture, the National Poet, and the Small Group of Women. Please welcome Miryam Segal.
Thanks, Joan. And thanks to you all for coming, and especially to my WSRP colleagues. And I just wanted to, actually the title of my book has been changed, so it's A New Sound in Hebrew Poetry. Liz put it up there for me, Joan. And I wanted to dedicate my talk tonight to the memory of a dear friend of mine, Lana Schwebel, who passed away last summer, who was a student of religion and of literature, and who's an inspiration to me. I first started thinking about questions of authorship and gender in Hebrew literature after reading a groundbreaking essay by Dan Miron. It was on the rise of women's poetry in the 1920s. And in examining the work of 4 of the women who published poetry in Hebrew in the 1920s, he describes the poetry of one of them, Rachel Bluestein, also known as Rachel, or Rachel the poet, as devoid of rich biblical allusion, as failing to build upon Jewish textual tradition. The national poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik, whose poetry first appeared in the 1890s, is credited with integrating Hebrew text, Bible, rabbinic literature, into modern poetry, thereby creating a modern poetic tradition. So Bialik comes to stand in for Jewish textual tradition itself, and I mean here not the poetic tradition, but for Bible, for scripture, for rabbinic literature. In short, as a poet, he's everything that Bluestein is not, according to Miron. Bialik makes of biblical allusion something new, often ironizing or melancholy, puts it into a new context. When Bluestein refers to biblical text, however, she's simply quoting. To prove his point, Miron cites her poem Aftergrowth, or rather the last 2 lines of the poem, in which she quotes rather than integrates a passage from the book of Isaiah. In short, he made a very convincing argument for Bluestein's particular role in Hebrew literary history, or he made what to me was a very convincing argument. That is until I sat down and read the poems myself at length and in full. And in the second half of this talk, I'm going to return to this poem and another poem of Bluestein's, which I think overturn most of the claims that are commonly made about her poetry. So in that moment when I realized that these poems did not resemble their criticism, if you will, that's when I started to see that for all that recent criticism has broken new ground, it also continues to rehearse the initial reception of women's poetry and of Bluestein's poetry from the 20s on. I saw how little criticism was able to step out of that initial reception or even distance itself from Bluestein's own instructions for how her poems ought to be read. And she was actually the first to promote herself as non-poetic, and her poetry is just a little something that she had jotted down. But if one follows the allusions in the poem and takes seriously the possibility that they might in fact signify, it becomes clear that neither her own superficial portrayal of her poetry nor contemporary criticism's analysis can account for the rhetoric in her poems or for the rise of women's poetry as a category in Hebrew in this period, in the culture of the 20s. The poem is ars poetica of the first order, and even as it weaves biblical allusion into this new context, it sets the stage precisely for a body of work that will seem to be unelusive, devoid of Jewish textuality, not because it's failed, but because it has, in some sense, exceeded allusion. In short, the poem is not going to be mistaken for a poem by Bialik, but it finds its own new way of using biblical allusion and does really all the things that criticism claims that it doesn't, or asserts that it doesn't do. And just as surprising, if one is coming to Bluestein's poetry through the criticism, through its reception, as I did. And actually, this is not just the academic looking glass where you sometimes get to things in this backwards way. It's the way that her poetry is read in the Israeli context as well, in the sense that, more so than other poets, I would say, her poetry always means something in particular, and that's in part because she's something of a folk hero, and her poetry is read in this popular national context. Just as surprising as her use of biblical allusion, if you come to her poetry through her reception, for me, was the realization that in this poem, she's responding to a poem by the national poet, Bialik, who, as I said, stands in for Jewish textual tradition with the proper way to integrate scripture into poetry. So even as she claims in the poem itself to be bypassing literary tradition and to be going straight to the source, to the land and to ancient times, she's alluding to a poem by Bialik, her near contemporary, who's writing about 30 years before her. And that poem of Bialik's is called Basadeh, In the Field. And in the field is actually precisely where the critics place Bluestein, or at least the corner of the field that's supposed to belong to women's poetry. D.A. Friedman, a critic writing in 1931, described Bluestein as the whitest and saddest flower in the portion of the field where the women plant their pains and joys. So this is a long history of this kind of reception of women's poetry in general, and Bluestein's in particular as her poetry in particular as utterance, as natural, as devoid of allusion to either biblical, to either Jewish textual tradition or to Bialik. What is an author? That's one question that I've been considering in reading Hebrew poetry of the early 20th century. What's an author, or what is the role of the poet in society in the 20s and 30s? The second question, which is a question that's been asked before and answered before in ways that I don't find entirely satisfactory, the second question is, why women's poetry now? Why is female authorship in poetry conceivable at precisely this moment in literary history, in the 1920s, when it didn't happen in the 1880s or the 1890s, or for almost 2 decades into the 20th century? I'm going to be answering these questions in the second half of my lecture through reading the poems of Bluestein in relation both to her contemporary labor poets, and I'll explain that term, as well as to her predecessor, the national poet Bialik. And my contention is that these two questions, one about authorship in general, the other about the timing of the appearance of women's poetry, these aren't only related questions, but they're mutually informing ones. And we're hard-pressed to formulate a satisfying answer to the one without also taking into account the other. I also contend that both these sets of questions are best answered through labor, or more precisely, with respect to the relationship between literature and the labor movement. So if the 19th century saw the rise of the romantic notion of the poet, and I mean this, of course, in the Hebrew context, Romanticism is older than this in the more general European context, but if the end of the 19th century saw the rise of this idea in Hebrew of the lonely, troubled, isolated prophet whose male biography, right, represented the collective, and Bialik would be certainly the paradigm here, of course, though not the only one. The 20s were characterized by what I call a symbolic deprofessionalization of poetry. So there's an arc of development in the conception of authorship from the artist, from the poet as an artist, to the poet as a common man, from the period of when Bialik is writing at the end of the 19th century, when he begins to write, to Blufstein. And this shift in the idea of what a poet is what enables the rise, the appearance of poetry by women. Now, I hope to demonstrate a number of things on my way by turning to labor. First, as I said, that the relationship between labor and literature created conditions that made female authorship possible, conceivable. Second, that these conditions explain the reception of women's poetry as non-elusive, or the need to see women's poetry in precisely that way. And third, that the relationship between labor and literature accounts for the non-intuitive reception of Blufstein and her colleagues, her female colleagues, Yocheved Bat Miryam, Esther Rab, Elisheva Bichovsky, the reception of these writers themselves as a group, although they belong to different schools and are writing in different styles. And another way to put this is, this will account for the reception of their poems as part of women's poetry, as working in the corner of the field of Hebrew literature, where the vast majority of the field is being farmed, being worked by men. So what is this relationship between labor and literature? Labor poetry was a dominant genre in Hebrew literature of the early 20th century, especially in the teens and the 20s. It valorized Jewish laborers in Palestine, and especially those who were involved in agricultural work, who worked the land. It valorized those workers. A.D. Gordon and Beryl Katznelson, who were leaders of the labor Zionist movement, were instrumental in translating the ideological needs of the movement into concrete poetic demands and expectations, generic expectations that they addressed to the Hebrew poets in Palestine. So the labor in labor poetry is not simply the work that was so valued in the settlement, in the Jewish settlement. It's the capital L labor of the eponymous movement that was making explicit demands on writers. In 1913, Gordon, one of the leaders of the labor movement, linked writing to agricultural labor. And he writes, "Their words are the voice of the hoe, the pruning hook, and the plow. Not only their words, but their feelings and thoughts are the fruit of labor and the fruit of the land, the fruit of the life of labor and the natural life of the land." So, rhetorically and politically, agricultural production is the source of authority for literary production. These words naturally grow out of the land and labor. And this kind of labor-motivated or labor-inspired writing is true, it's natural, and it's genuine. 7 or 8 years later, in 1921, Gordon addressed the Writers' Association. And in contrast to what he wrote in 1913, and I just read you what I just read from a moment ago, in which there wasn't really a category of the writer. Here, the title of his talk is "The Writers and the Workers." But even here, the writers are still meant to serve labor, to imbue the life of the worker with some kind of spirit or meaning. And he says in his speech, "The main thing here is not that writers should necessarily do physical labor, but that their own work in their own sphere needs to somehow be set in the weave of the life of the idea of labor." So, the writers need not actually engage in physical labor, Gordon says, but what? Perhaps they should. So echoing in these words is Gordon's earlier statement, series of statements in 1913, that sometimes the best writing is actually what the laborers themselves write, rather than what the poets write. So how do the poets respond to such a demand or such a hint? What does their side of the conversation with labor sound like? So writers were both obedient to labor demands, and of course, as poets will do, they complicated that message. One way that poetry could do its part for the labor movement was by making the concerns of laborers the stuff of poetry. So if, as Gordon claimed, writing on concrete matters and actual participation in things made for the best literature, however unintentionally, or in other words, if laborers are the best poets, then it would be a great advantage for the poets themselves to be laborers also. And actually, some were, although usually only for a very short period of time. Including Blufstein, who worked at Kinneret before she fell ill. The labor poems of Avraham Shlonsky, for example, and he also actually, when he first came to Palestine in the early 1920s, he spent about a year and a half working in Ein Harod, which later became a kibbutz, but at the time was, a bunch of tents, really. So the labor poems of Shlonsky, who's a central poet of the period, often featured a laboring speaker. One poem, part of his cycle called Amal, Toil, has a plural speaker, a collective, who speaks of and then addresses the working hand. We have a small hand, she has 5 fingers. Grow wild fingernails, we are going to toil. The laborer comes to be an everyman, sort of a representative of the everyman, although most Jews in Palestine at the time were, of course, not laborers. A figure speaking for a we, for a collective, is perhaps a more effective way of integrating the image of the laborers as representing the readers themselves and addressing the laborer's own body, in this case his hand, but muscles and hair, etc., closes the poetic circle around the laboring body and all but eliminates foreign bodies that might otherwise have been the addressee. So the hero of these poems is the workers, or you could say the anti-hero of the poems. In the second of Shlonsky's 4-poem cycle, Toil, the same cycle of poems, the speaker addresses his sweat. Oh, sweat, oh, blessed beads descending from my high forehead like the dew from pure heavens. Behold, my flesh is pure and hairy, and the hair, black grass. Oh, sweat, salty sweat, drench my skin with dew like a morning field. Hallelujah. So in comparing the sweat dripping from his forehead to dew falling from the sky, or his flesh to a field in the morning and his hair to grass, the speaker's actually making the laborer a microcosm for the entire natural world. In making labor and laborers their main concern, poets were not merely following the lead of these labor leaders. They weren't merely fulfilling the requirements. They're also engaging in a conversation about the role of poetry. For if the stuff, and it's interesting because if they make the life of the worker and the things of labor, they thematize labor in their poetry, the work itself is very often absent from the poems, and that absence is even marked. It's noted in the poems themselves. So, for example, Mordechai Temkin's poem, he's a contemporary of Bluestein and of Shlonsky, and writing here this poem from the early 1920s, in the poem Tsarli, It Pains Me, begins, It pains me that I am not one of those who works the land. It pains me that I'm a poet, alone. It pains me that I have not embraced the land, and it is painful to think that soon I will depart with unplanted seeds in my hand. And in another poem he writes, I have not been blessed with the hands of a conqueror and a builder of the homeland. How it disturbs me that they, and he's talking here about his hands, that they rest on my knees quietly with transparent tendons, while across from me many worn-out hands bear like gifts dark wounds of the homeland. So each of these poems bears the mark of labor poetry, that is, a concern with or a valorization of or a description of the labor and also the laborer. But in each of these poems, labor appears because it's missing elsewhere, most often in the life of the speaker. Temkin's poet-speaker obsesses over this Gordonian problem of the value of the writer. Why am I a poet and not a worker? And he asks this question over and over in different ways. Why are my hands unblemished while those of the workers before me are calloused? Why do I spend time writing when I could be doing something of more use to the settlement? So his anxiety is based on this assumption that, or this belief really, that life is a zero-sum game, that every moment spent on poetry could have been put to better use. And that's actually a catch-22 inherent in the idea of labor poetry, if you think about it. If the poet charges himself with the task of praising labor and making it the central value of society, and goes on and on about that, I mean, at some point it occurs to the reader, well, if it's so important, why are you writing all these poems? Why not go do something? So Temkin doesn't present himself as a laborer, as some of the labor poets do, and they find another way they all find their own ways of dealing with this implicit, inherent competition between laborer and writer. But he doesn't, so he's not the worker who plows by day and writes by candlelight. He's taken on another role, and I would say that in some sense, he serves labor in that role more continuously and completely than the real laborers do. just in the rhetorical sense, in that he maintains a connection to the classic trope of desire that's important to labor ideology and also to Hebrew culture in general. Temkin's poetry maintains a desire for labor and a desire for the land in a way that an actual laborer cannot. So if a Jew in Eastern Europe longs to move to Palestine and work on building a road or on a farm, once he gets to Palestine and gets to do that, well, he's consummated his desire for the motherland or for labor. But Temkin's poet-speakers tell constantly of wasted and spilled seed, of unconsummated desire, and so there's the need to continue to speak of this. In some sense, then, laborless labor poetry is actually an excessive form of labor poetry rather than a deficient one. For in these poems, authorship is as dependent on labor as is possible. Even as the speaker acknowledges that he hasn't been working, he's defining his role entirely based on that lack, and indirectly, therefore, with respect to labor. So in a variety of ways, and most of them are not nearly as neurotic as Temkin's mode, writers made poetry peripheral. Poems were as if secondary, as if unimportant, uttered off the cuff by a laborer after a day's work, or inspired by the poet's observation of the worker. So how does this help us explain the rise of female authorship in poetry in the 1920s, or the reception of the poetesses as a group of poets, although they belong to very different schools? So I've been arguing that the conception of Hebrew authorship in this period was formed through a conversation between literature and the labor movement. In order to understand the factors that allow for the rise of women's poetry as a category in Hebrew literature in the 1920s, I'm going to look to this relationship again, and to the status of women in the labor movement. The position of women within the labor movement was in some ways parallel to the position of the writer as articulated in labor poetry. Women in the new Jewish settlement in Palestine actualized that ambivalent position that labor poetry describes. Now, the difference, of course, is that the role that the poets created was a literary one, an imaginary one, a pretense of the subjugation of poetry to labor, but not an actual one. Women played an essential role, symbolic role, but were excluded from full participation. The movement claimed to be proud of women's participation, and possibly as a sign of their own modernity that, well, we have women who are working, unlike, say, the Arab women who have different jobs, who have gendered roles. So if poets were both inside and outside working society, at least in the fiction of their poems, in that ambivalent position, women were in a very similar position vis-a-vis the labor movement in day-to-day life, regardless of whether they were writers or not. Manual labor in general, and agricultural labor in particular, and road building also, the subjects of much labor poetry, were also of the highest value in the Jewish settlement. And this valorization, of course, has roots in the various socialist movements in Russia. So the decision to emigrate from Russia was influenced by poor conditions for Jews, and famously by the pogroms of 1903 to 1905, especially for those who came in the great immigration wave of 1904 to 1914. But the vision, whatever their immediate reasons for coming, the vision of these emigres was nevertheless very often a socialist, Zionist socialist one. As the sociologist Deborah Bernstein has shown, women as a group shared this vision. Women as a rule, in other words, shared this vision. Many saw their role as that of the worker herself, rather than as the nurturer, the wife, the mother, who somehow enables the new Jewish laborer. But they were stymied on the individual level on a fairly consistent basis. For example, the World Zionist Organization's office in Palestine paid men their salaries directly, but not women, on the assumption that the female workers were actually employees of the members of the collective. And when they say members of the collective, they mean the men. To combat this systematic discrimination, women started agricultural training programs and women's collectives. And the goal of the training programs was to provide for women the kind of training that men were able to get on the job, because they found it a lot easier to find jobs, in order to make the women more employable. So the success that women did have was most often through ongoing training programs and through these collectives, first in agriculture and later in construction, when that became a larger part of the economy, especially in the British Mandate, and the switch from the Ottoman Empire to the British Mandate. There were, of course, pragmatic reasons for this success of the collectives. when an individual woman was sent to the mostly male or entirely male work settlement, she would inevitably be assigned the housework, basically. Although that's a misleading term here, because we're talking about a young woman / girl, teenage girl, who didn't necessarily have any experience cooking, who'd be sent to cook 3 meals a day for 20 or 30 or 40 men or more with the most meager supplies. So we're talking actually pretty back-breaking work. But if everyone in the collective was female, this meant that women would have the opportunity to participate in the most ideologically valuable work as well, because there only were women there to do any of the work. But I believe that there are also symbolic reasons for the success of this small group of women. A lone woman working in the fields would be a heroine, an outlier. And this is what a romantic hero is, really, right? Both special, even unique, and also representative of the larger group of the nation. But how could a woman represent the nation? A small group, on the other hand, is proof of something, a phenomenon, if you will, a sign, perhaps, of the nation's modernity. We let our women work. The women's collective, then, it came to stand for or be associated with this idea of a small group of women working together and succeeding in the men's domain. And just as an aside, it's not that women never were never able to represent the nation, but when they did, it was more through this connection that women were seen to have to ancient authenticity. And actually, this postcard, which is originally a photograph taken in 1921 of clearly an Eastern European Jew who came to Palestine and is dressed up as a shepherdess, is one example of this idea that women are somehow closer to the authentic ancient identity of the Jews. But that's the sort of limited, feminized way that women were able to represent the nation. Tzvi Livni, who was a member of Hapoel HaTzair, the young workers' organization, he was in charge of placing new immigrants in jobs in the settlement in Palestine. And I'm going to read from an anecdote he tells. The context here is a discussion of how difficult it was in general to place women in the kinds of men's work that they often wanted, and they wanted work that they wanted for ideological and idealistic reasons, because this was a valued work. And he says, on one of the ships in the summer of 1920, there were 7 girls aged 17 to 18 from Galicia, members of the Hashomer HaTzair youth movement, who asked to be sent to work as soon as possible and together. In those days, there was no work for women in the agricultural settlements. Those responsible for road construction also forbade the absorption centers from sending women to the roads. But they persist and insist that they want to be sent together and to do something of that nature. And in the end, he gives in. Okay, tomorrow you'll go out on the road. In my letter to the administrators of the road construction, I called them the Bat-Sheva Collective, the Beth-Sheba Collective. They started on their way, but I was uneasy. What would I do if they were sent back to me? And what would happen if their health was ruined by the stone and gravel? And then several months later, he's visited by one of the overseers of the road builders. With a trembling heart, I asked him, listen, have you heard from the 7 girls of Galicia working on the roads? You mean the Bat-Sheva Collective? How could I help but know about them? They've revolutionized road work. Their daily quota is as high as that of the most experienced and conscientious men, and often even higher. The whole camp brags about them and considers their excellence at this hard work nothing short of miraculous. So, with all due respect to the Bat-Sheva Collective, it seems to me that they gained a certain cachet as the exceptional women workers. And this is remarkably similar to the reception of women's poetry as a genre and the poetesses as a group simply by virtue of gender. Bluestein herself speaks of the poetesses as a group, and she's even worried at a certain point that the reputation of one of them is inauthentic, going back to this idea of if women were going to represent the nation in some way, it was through their supposed authenticity, greater authenticity. She was worried that something in the poetic persona of one of them is inauthentic would threaten the possibility of women's poetry for all the others. And if you recall my earlier citation of one critic, if Bluestein is, I would sort of riff that and say, if Bluestein is in the women's corner of the field, then she herself is part of a women's collective of sorts, part of a small group of women in a field of men, in this case, the field of poetry. So the labor-literature relationship, then, also explains the timing of the rise of women's poetry. Women's poetry appears not in the romantic moment that immediately precedes the modernist moment. in Hebrew literature. It happens not at the moment in which the poet as an individual, as a latter-day prophet, stands in for the collective, for the many. Rather, it's the moment when poetry speaks from the position of the immigrant, settler, the laborer in Palestine, when poetry is symbolically deprofessionalized, that the possibility of female authorship opens up. Women's poetry was possible when the relationship between poet and laborer in the symbolic realm was analogous to the status of women vis-a-vis men within the labor movement. So at the moment when poet to laborer is parallel to women vis-a-vis men. I want to turn now to Blufstein's poems to read the poetry of this woman and labor poet with respect to what I call laborless labor poetry. And I've given some examples earlier on, Temkin's poetry, for example, and Shlinsky's poetry, some of his poems. The poetry, in other words, read her with respect to the poetry of her contemporaries. And I'd also like to read her with respect to the predecessors that she supposedly lacks, namely Bialik and Scripture. First I need to... Here we go. I'll read it in Hebrew and in English. Hen lo charashti, gam lo zarati, lo hitpalalti al hamatar, ufetta re'ena stotai hitzmichu, dagan beruch shemesh bimkom daldal. Ha'im usfiach ktuvot mikedem? Chitei chedvahem ktsurim me'az, asher pkaduni vimei ha'oni, bak'u aluvi be'orachaz. Sag segna skena shadmot apele, sag segna skena ugmol nachish, ani zocheret divrei hanocham, tochlu safiach, ve'af sachish. Behold, I have not plowed, nor have I sowed. I haven't prayed for rain. And suddenly see, my fields have grown, sun-blessed grain instead of thistle. Is this the aftergrowth of ancient produce, grains of joy cut then, that have visited me during the days of distress, burst forth, risen up in me in a mysterious way? Flourish, grow, fields of wonder. Flourish, grow, and ripen quick. I remember the words of comfort. Eat, safiach, and also sachish. The speaker here seems at first to be a laborer who has seen her fields not follow biblical or natural law, or exceed natural or biblical promise. But at the same time, that very unnaturalness is described in biblical terms. Aftergrowth is edible vegetation, and it's a phenomenon mentioned in the Bible. It invokes the biblically mandated fallow year. Every 7 years the land shall be fallow. But it's an uncultivated growth. It's basically the scattered seed of earlier crops as it was gathered. In other words, it's precisely not the product of labor, and it grows once labor has ceased. It marks, if you will, a loss of labor. And in fact, if you look at the beginning of the poem, there's also a negation of labor from the very start of the poem. Behold, I have not plowed, nor have I sowed. But why has the speaker not sowed? This stanza, I would claim, is a kind of fulfillment of a fantasy of the biblical fallow year. So the speaker didn't work the land. She let it lay fallow. And this trust, or this foolishness, was rewarded by something much better than the mere aftergrowth that's described in the Bible. Now, one of Adam's punishments after the sin in Eden was that thistle would grow in the land unless he worked the land. So Blufstein here has taken two evocations of the land in the Bible and God's promises regarding labor and rest, namely the fallow year and the punishment for Adam's sin, and she's integrated them into a new context of a farmer's passivity and pleasant surprise. And in this moment, I'm thinking of, in the language that I'm choosing here, just the claim about Blufstein that, unlike Bialik, she merely quotes instead of putting biblical text into new and surprising context. In the second stanza, the critical words are then and ancient. In the first and second line, ancient produce and cut then. If the grain she sees has been generated by ancient sources, then a supernatural force is necessarily at work. And in some sense, the poem is centered on this question of paternity, of the origin of this seed from which this miraculous aftergrowth has sprouted. That have visited me, I'm at the end of the second stanza, during the days of distress, burst forth, risen up in me in a mysterious way. On the elusive level, the me here is a Sarah figure, from the Bible. The grains of joy, this aftergrowth of ancient produce, visited me, Pikaduni, the speaker, as God visited Pakad, Sarah, when she conceived a child. Sarah no longer had the way of women, Orach Kanashim, a menstrual cycle and fertility, so the birth of her child was therefore a miracle. The grains have likewise sprung up in mysterious ways, be'oach raz. So the Sarah figure actually turns out to be the land itself, or the land herself, also feminine, Eretz Adama, both feminine words. The grains have risen up in me, the land, during the days of distress. So again, I ask, does she create something new through intertextual references or not? I hope that even just with the first two stanzas, I've convinced you that she does. But the last stanza is the one where that has been accused most pointedly of quoting biblical text. So let's move to that. Flourish, grow, fields of wonder. Flourish, grow, and ripen quick. I remember the words of comfort. Eat safiach, aftergrowth, and also sachish. Now, the final lines here are clearly alluding to the biblical prophecy that speaks of the Israelites having to eat safiach, aftergrowth, and sachish, which is a synonym, but also a kind of lesser aftergrowth, the aftergrowth of the aftergrowth that grows from the seeds that were dropped when you pulled the aftergrowth out the first year. So what grows from that the second year. And this is from Isaiah. It also appears in Kings, this prophecy they're just very similar texts. God is angry at the people and will punish them, but there's going to be a sign at some point. And this shall be a sign to thee. You shall eat this year such things as grow of themselves, safiach, aftergrowth, and in the second year that which springs of the same, sachish. And in the third year sow and reap and plant vineyards and eat their fruits. So in the biblical verse, the comfort would seem to be not in the part of the passage that Bluestein is alluding to, but in the following segment where the prophet actually describes the third year when the people will once again be able to work the land and plant the crops and reap the rewards of their labor rather than having to eat this measly aftergrowth. So unless she's misremembering the text, she's not quoting the biblical text, but rewriting it. And furthermore, as I've mentioned, this is sun-blessed grain. I think I've mentioned sun-blessed grain. It's a surprise in line 3. I suddenly see. So it's ancient produce that somehow has revived itself rather than the unappetizing biblical aftergrowth. The speaker has at the very least modified biblical aftergrowth, and I think she's done a lot more than that rhetorically speaking. If the speaker is the land herself, the land itself of bygone days, perhaps we should see the speaker less as someone who may or may not weave biblical verses, as Bialik does, and more as a being who is somehow parallel to the Bible, who provides another record of the ancient past. So the poetics here move beyond allusion. She remembers the words of comfort, not because she's read the Bible, not because she's read Isaiah or Kings, but because these words were uttered in her presence centuries, millennia ago. She, the land, witnessed all that is also recorded in the Bible about the land of Canaan and of Israel. Now, this is a trick, of course, a pretense of exceeding the limits of textuality, and she's no less dependent than Bialik is for the production, the generation of meaning in her poetry through the Bible, or the accumulation of meaning in these lines. But her poetics seems to exceed Bialik's in making her speaker superior to the Bible or prior to the Bible, and in pretending to rely on some kind of oral transmission. So she's even bypassing the Bible, that most basic Hebrew text of the Hebrew literary tradition. But she's certainly jumping over the entire middle of the Hebrew tradition, rabbinic literature, more recent Jewish texts of the diaspora, and, of course, Bialik. Now, as I mentioned, this poem is built around a question of paternity. From whence this amazing crop? From whence my Hebrew poetry? So it's particularly interesting in a poem that's about poetic paternity, in a sense, that it claims to ignore or maybe to be immune to textual tradition, that the poem is also alluding to a work written 30 years earlier by the father of modern Hebrew poetry, Bialik. At the opening of In the Field, Basadeh, the speaker goes out to the field somewhere in Russia, to the open land, in order to make a connection with the land, Haaretz, the land of Israel, in other words. Towards the end of the poem, and I've only given you here, I'm showing you here just the last 3 stanzas of this poem, from 1894. Towards the end of the poem, he witnesses a sign, maybe, and actually throughout the poem, he goes out to the fields initially to listen to the rustling of the grain and to hear some kind of divine or mystical message. So towards the end of the poem, he witnesses the wind blowing the ears of grain away. And then there's a series which will ring a bell for the readers for us, because we've read Blufstein's poem. And I'm reading here from the third line that you have up there. My hands have not formed you, sheaves, nor have my hands tended your stalks. My strength was not spent in this work. I shall not gather it. The drops of my sweat have not wet the furrows of your black soil, nor has my prayer brought down heaven's rain upon your fallow ground. And you'll actually hear here also some echoes, or it's the reverse. Shlonsky, of course, also echoes Bialik here. But the speaker ends with an address to the fields, telling them how dear they are to him. And now he's still in the fields in Eastern Europe, telling them how dear they are to him, not least because they remind him of my distant brothers working in my mother's house, meaning in the land of Israel, who may at this very moment raise their voice from mountaintop and hill and sing to, or respond to, my blessing sent to them from me. So Bialik's Jew of the exile is attempting to bridge the gap between his own geographic location and the land of Israel through this windswept grain, though he also makes a more simple rhetorical connection by analogy between the fields he sees, that he's standing in, and the fields in which his distant brothers are working over there. Inasmuch as Blufstein is responding to Bialik's poem, she's also projecting space onto time and replacing his origins with more authoritative ones. She doesn't trace the seed back to some diasporic longing, to the person that she herself was actually some time ago. She doesn't merely connect to the land of Israel, as Bialik's speaker can only hope to do, but to what is most ancient and authentic in the soil, a seed that's been sitting there for millennia. It's as if even her reference to Bialik undoes the poem's connection to the diasporic middle of Jewish history by correcting or retrieving the truest source of Hebrew culture. Bialik's and Blufstein's respective early poetics share a concern with the locus of poetic utterance. So it's a foundational circumstance for each of them. It makes poetic utterance possible. It makes it poetic utterance necessary. The act of raising one's voice in song is motivated by the poet's place, and in particular, for both of them, by the relation between the land of Israel and the possibility of writing poetry. So between the land of Israel and the possibility of writing for Blufstein in the land of Israel and for Bialik in the diaspora. Bialik is writing in and from the diaspora, while Blufstein writes Hebrew poetry only once she's arrived in Palestine. In fact, she learns Hebrew at a relatively late age. She writes from the Holy Land. And these positions are repeatedly marked in these poems and in other poems, as are the ramifications of those different positions. So Blufstein's To My Land and Bialik's Poetry of Israel, Shirat Yisrael, are two such poems. And I want to spend a few moments tracing the intertextual connection between the two, between Blufstein and her predecessor, and conclude by positioning the poems vis-a-vis her contemporaries, that is, with respect to labor and laborless labor poetry. Adonai l'kra'ani lisruas milchama, gam reach milchama me'od yichiteni, elafes ki eshma kol chatzos barama, v'chinor v'cherev lakinor hineni. Ach ashrei hagibor hachayal charbehu, sheyishlach es yado lahalmus amelim, v'oy lo lamshoer shechala libehu, hashares shirosav, alibos arelim. Ki mashir Yisrael bagola, tzitz yavesh, tzitz ul peshetal oras olav lo yartev, zragad shenafal, el refesh ve'avesh, pakua shasholfa v'yavsha b'martev. God did not call me to the battle cry, and the scent of war terrifies me. I should faint upon hearing the distant sound on the hill. Between the harp and the sword, I am for the harp. But praise be the hero who lives by his sword, who reaches his hand to the workman's hammer, and woe be to the poet who profanes his heart, who sings his song upon uncircumcised hearts. For what is the poetry of Israel in exile? A desiccated bud, a withering bud whose leaves the dew of light does not moisten, a coriander seed that has turned to mire and mold, a blossom unsheathed that dried out in the cellar. Bialik sets up a dichotomy in this poem, in the poetry of Israel, and that's between the warrior and the poet. In many of his poems from this period, Bialik is imagining poetry over there in Palestine. And this is in the 1890s when there wasn't much poetry over there in Palestine. Poetry was really where he is in Eastern Europe. And we even see a hint of this at the end of In the Field, the previous poem by Bialik, where he listens for a cry, for a response, using the word anu, ve'anu gam hem, which means to sing, and the word that's used in the Bible for the women's song at the sea, Vatan lahem Miryam, but also means to respond. So in the Field, he does this by setting up a kind of puzzle. I have my working brothers in the fields over there, they're working, and I, the speaker, am over here, in the fields here, singing my poetry. So what's missing? The missing element is the speaker over there, the poetry that isn't where it belongs. So he goes to the field in the Field. Yes, he goes there as if to find a shortcut to get to Palestine, as if he could sort of get there through jumping from one field to the next. But there's also the sense that he hopes to bring something into being by going out to the fields, by calling for a Hebrew poetry from where it belongs. By calling for a Hebrew poetry from Palestine, it may actually come to life. So in the Poetry of Israel, in this poem, he fills another part of this kind of series of chiasmus. For the poem is not merely calling for poetry in Palestine, which he does in other poems, but it's actually going a step further in dismissing the Hebrew poetry of the diaspora, which at the moment is pretty much all there is, and dismissing his own poetry, which is poetry, Hebrew poetry of the diaspora, and even this very poem. And the poem opens with this repetitive negation that where he says, God did not call me to war or to the trumpet of war. And these kind of negations, of course, always inevitably lead to the question of what did happen. Well, then, what did God call you for? And the question is presumably answered in the fourth and final line of the stanza, harp or sword, I'm for the harp. I'm the poet. So there's an implicit evoking of prophecy here of the speaker being called by God to poetry, an evocation that is pretty much absent from the Blufstein poem that we'll look at in a moment, and in which, in fact, the relationship between God and the speaker is reversed. So in the poem, I'll show you in a moment, in fact, maybe I can even do it now. The speaker addresses the land rather than mentioning the possibility of the land addressing the speaker. I have a disappearing poem. There we go. So I'll start with the Hebrew. Lo sharti lach artzi velo pe'arti shmech ba'alilot gvura bishlal kravot. Rak etz yaday nat'u chofei Yarden shoktim. Rak shvil kavshu raglai al pnei sadot. Achen dala me'od, yadati zot ha'em. Achen dala me'od minchat bitech. Rak kol tuat agil biyom yiga ha'or. Rak bechi b'mistarim alei onyech. I have not sung to you, my land, nor have I glorified your name with acts of valor, with the booty of war. My hands have planted but a tree on the quiet Jordan shores. My legs have trodden down but a path over the fields. It's very meager indeed. I know that, mother. It's very meager indeed, your daughter's offering. Just a cry of joy on a day when the light shines. Just a sob in hiding for your suffering. So the rhetoric of negation of Blufstein closely follows the pattern set by Bialik's poem. In the case of the Poetry of Israel, Bialik's poem, the speaker hasn't been called to war or to war's trumpet. And the smell of war scares him. In the case of To My Land, and here I should probably note for you that the mother here is the motherland, is an address to the land. The speaker is the subject rather than the object of the call, but she's also similarly disengaged. I have not praised you through tales of bravery or through the booty of war. So you can actually see, it's probably more clear in the Hebrew, that Blufstein's poem is a kind of homologous structure with Bialik's. So Bialik's first stanza, is God calling me? No. In Blufstein, am I singing to my land? No. And in both cases, war or battle is somehow negated or pushed aside. In the second stanza, each of the poems intertwines the language of labor and of war. So Bialik, when he uses the term worker's hammer to describe war, and it's actually a term used in Deborah's song in the book of Judges to describe Yael's murder of Sisera. So it's the context from which he draws it, of course, is also already using workers' language to describe war, the way that Sisera was killed. Blufstein when she speaks of my legs have conquered, my legs have trodden down a path. I've translated it here, but it's shvil kavshu raglai. My legs have conquered, made this conquest of a path in order to describe labor. And it's interesting, by the way, that she's talking about this path that her feet have conquered. So we have here something similar to, but somehow more modest, smaller than the road building, which was so ideologically important, something kind of a feminized version, as if, of road building. In the third stanza of Bialik's poem and in the second stanza of Bluestein's, each in a sense is answering the question, what is poetry? His poem is called The Poetry of Israel, and hers seems to be more personal. It's her own small offering that she's speaking of. At the same time, in commenting on Bialik's poem, in speaking of her poem as a hidden sob to Bialik's dried out bud, also rotting in the cellar, also in hiding, or in secret, hidden away. In juxtaposing his poem about Hebrew, or her poem to his about Hebrew poetry in the diaspora, to the one of her own that she calls My Land, she's quietly flattering her own poetic choices. Her poem completes the chiasmus that he begins. This is a poem in close proximity to the land. This is a poem addressed to the land in this intimate way. As we saw in the title poem of her first book, Aftergrowth, the symbol of her poetry is this aftergrowth. What is the symbol of poetry of the diaspora, or the poetry of Bialik in the diaspora, in his words? He says, for what is the poetry of Israel in exile? This is the last stanza. A desiccated bud, a withering bud whose leaves the dew of light does not moisten, a coriander seed, or manna, that has turned to mire and mold, a blossom unsheathed that dried out in the cellar. So I'm not going to interpret all of these, but his poetry, the one that's most relevant at the moment, is his poetry is like the leftover manna that the Israelites, coriander seed is also a name for the manna, that the Israelites in the desert tried to save for the next day when they weren't supposed to. Hebrew poetry then, in the diaspora at least, is like this miraculous food that's falling from the sky. It's something amazing that's been left to rot, that's gone moldy. Bluestein's poetry, by contrast, is something that began its life as leftovers, some lines of verse that a woman might jot down quickly, stalks of grain that were left behind, but that have now blossomed into something miraculous and delicious. Earlier I cited some laborless labor poems by Temkin, including one in which he laments the fact that he's a poet rather than a laborer. It pains me, tsarly. And I mentioned that he's setting up a relationship between literature and labor that's a zero-sum game, as either or. Because he chooses to be a poet, he neither plants crops nor embraces the land. To My Land would seem to be doing something similar. It would seem that the speaker's gift of poems is modest because she's busied herself with manual labor instead of with poetry. In the first stanza, after all the modest labors of the speaker planted a tree, conquered a path, or trod a path, these actions are juxtaposed to the brave and glorious feats that the speaker did not accomplish, like the battles in the battlefield, and are also juxtaposed to poetry writing. I have not sung to you. But the poem is more sinuous than that would imply, and the vehicle and tenor of the metaphors seem to switch throughout the poem, so that one can't really grasp this as easily as I did for Temkin's poems as a zero-sum game. Is the writing that she speaks of, or the singing or the poetry, a metaphor for more concrete or violent action? Is the labor standing in for the art? Which is supposed to be metaphorizing which, symbolizing which? On the one hand, this poem of Bluestein's is actually closer to the labor leader's demands than even Temkin's poems, in that the speaker doesn't have time for poetry. Most of her time is taken up with these admittedly modest labors. But, of course, writing a poem about not working, as Temkin does ad infinitum, is entirely different from writing a poem about not writing poems. In the latter case, the poem itself, of course, stands in contradiction to its own rhetoric. And in the former case, well, the fact of the poem may very well prove that the speaker hasn't worked, right? That's what he says. All I'm doing is writing these poems. I'm not working. So her offering to the land, her cry of joy, her cry of sadness, these small little gestures that symbolize her poetry, they're poor not because she has worked too much and so she doesn't have time. It's that she She only makes small gestures, whatever her field of operation is at the moment. Poetry is modest because work is modest. Her work is modest. But she doesn't say that the one suffers as a result of her attention to the other. She engages neither in poetry nor in any of her other tasks as a profession. The problem of the divide between poetry and labor is, for most poets, contingent on the effort that each requires. And this is true even for poets other than Temkin, for Shkelsky too. The divide does not present itself, to some extent, the divide does not present itself in Blufstein's poetry as it does in Temkin's and others, because in her poetics, effort is peripheral at best. The genre of labor poetry presented Blufstein with an opportunity to write women's poetry, to write as a woman. For a moment in literary history, the conception of authorship was feminine, at least in relation to labor. The poet's pretense for a time was that literature, and again this was a pretense, was that he was subservient, secondary, peripheral to labor. In short, his imaginary position vis-a-vis the laborer was similar to the woman's actual status vis-a-vis the new Jewish settlement. Unlike Temkin, Blufstein doesn't place poetry and work in direct competition. She retains this ambiguity and ambivalence between labor and literature, or ambivalence of labor and literature towards each other, between doing just a small thing and doing something grand and heroic, between being an important participant in the labor movement and in poetry, and one who's on the periphery, occupying both positions and neither position fully because she's a woman. Reading Blufstein's poetry in conversation with her contemporaries and with Bialik, it seems necessary in the context of this reception if we are to understand what a poet is, not just in this genre of women's poetry, but in general, for men and women writing in all the various genres and schools of Hebrew literature. Read without precedent, as Blufstein's poems so often are, her poetry sprouts from the land like uncultivated wheat, and her story about her modesty and simplicity can be taken at face value. But read as a response to Bialik, her poems seem not quite as modest and not quite as lacking in confidence. For if the poetry of Israel, as well as Bialik's other poems, such as In the Fields and To the Bird, and really a large part of his oeuvre, call for a poetry that is sung from the land, not where he's standing, but over there from the land, that is precisely what Blufstein does. She is one of those workers on a hill in Palestine who he describes in the field. And it is she who finally sings, who's responding to his request for poetry in Palestine some 30 years later. Thank you.
That Blufstein's poetry, as you laid it out, I mean, even with the very first poem that you showed us, have all sorts of biblical references that are totally subtle. And so that whole rhetoric that has been built up around her stuff, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think you just clarified that. And so I just want to say, I'm one convinced consumer here. I'm not quite yet figuring out all the references to Bialik that she's making, but I did want to say there were two things that came to mind. In the first poem that you showed us of her, there's been a lot of feminist work on ancient Greek poetry and literature, like Paige Dubois' Sewing the Body, and it's about the woman's body as field. Mm-hmm. And I thought that, I don't know, you may actually use that in your longer paper, but it might be of some interest, so I just wanted to throw that out. But the second thing is, this is a question. Is it Temkin?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. His poem, The Laborless Laborer of Poetry, right? Or, it's the poet who is laborless. And that whole poem about it pains me that I'm not doing this and that whole thing. As you read that to us, I was wondering about there, of course, is this whole the social group that you're examining of poets in early Israel in the 20s there's this tension between working the land, working with one's hands, and art. Okay, so I do understand that. But I am wondering, that poem to me sounded like a particular genre that my 10-year-old daughter has been bringing home. She's learning poetry at school, and maybe it's Robert Frost. Who's the one who wrote the thing about I ate the plums in the refrigerator? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Right. I don't know who it is, but anyways, it's a genre of I ate the plums. I'm sorry. You know, it's this apologizing thing at the same time building up what one's actually doing. And when you read that, it sounded like that genre to me of you know, I'm no good, you know, I'm just a poet and I'm not a laborer, all I have is these meager offerings. But as it played out, it was a subversive way of presenting one's work. I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to start from your last comment,
and
if I can remember them, comments on what you said before. Yeah, I think in the case, I chose Temkin in part because I didn't have to spend the time to kind of unpack the poem. But other poets do this more subtly, and also, I said before Shlunsky, but he actually does something a little bit different in resolving that relationship. But in William Carlos Williams, I mean, the poem is kind of framed by, you know, this is a note. And so there's a complexity there of this tension between, you know, what the note is or what, I mean, there is that relationship between conversation in the real world and what a poem is, and the kind of strain of rhetorical language, which in Temkin is not, I don't see it so much in Temkin's poems. I mean, he also has all these poems about the seed. I mentioned the seed that, you know, that he wants to scatter, or this unfulfilled, unconsummated desire for the motherland. And there's something kind of sweet about these poems, but they don't have that sort of complexity, I think. Or the ones that do this don't seem to have much of that. Although, you know, they have their own beauty, but they don't seem to do much of that. But they are poems of apology, certainly. The pastoral was definitely on the minds of these writers. There's no question. I don't know that it was necessarily going back to classical poetry, but certainly through the influences it had on English poetry and the pastoral and the relationship to the field, the relationship between the field and poetry, which is a long and complex and rich relationship. They're definitely drawing on that in these poems, and Blufstein actually is drawing on that probably more explicitly even than the others. In terms of the relationship between her poems, I'd say, and Bialik's, oops, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry. Okay, well, we'll just look at this one because that's what I have on the screen. You see where it says, I'll do it in the English where I hope it's also clear from the, so I haven't done this, I haven't done that. What haven't I done? I haven't harvested. He has the words harvesting, and I haven't watered the land, essentially. I haven't prayed, okay, which is the opening, which are all elements in the opening stanza of Blufstein's poem. I haven't plowed, I haven't sowed, I haven't prayed for rain, I haven't done all these things. You know, I think it's a little more obvious in the Hebrew that they're connected, but this listing of things that haven't been done vis-a-vis the fields or the agricultural work, which for Blufstein and Bialik have different reasons for that lack. For Bialik, it's because I'm in the wrong place. I'm stuck here. I'm in the exile. I long for this, but I can't reach it. And for Blufstein, again, I think she's also more subtle on this, you know, well, I'm here and I'm a worker, but I'm not really working. And I think that is somehow tapping into the position of women in the Yishuv, where they are part of it, but they're not quite part of it. And so she's kind of doing it in a more unified way, in a certain way, more like Shlunsky tackles this problem, although he does it in an explicitly confident way. Let's see if I can... And then here, with these two poems, The real connection is, or no, there are many connections here, and I think in a way this is more the entirety of these two of Blufstein's poem "To My Land" is kind of can be superimposed on Bialik, so that you can see the differences, or you can see the moments when she's critiquing or commenting. But the rhetoric here of so as I said, Bialik says, "God hasn't called me," and so has God called me? No. I've sung to the land. No, I haven't sung to the land. And also, this is all kind of contingent on the fact that the land is filling in here for God, and that the labor movement called itself the religion of labor. So there's all this implicit rhetorical replacement of religious ritual with labor ritual. And that kind of goes through the whole poem. And again, it's a little bit harder to see in the translation, of course. But the intertwining of different fields of metaphors, of labor and of war, of song and of war. But again, for Bialik, as for Temkin, in very different ways, but for each of them, it's this clear divide between two different elements. And for Blufstein, it's far more intertwined. The elements are far more intertwined. So, I haven't sung to you, my land. So you've done the work? Well, I've done these little things here and there. It's much more cagey. And I think that when you see how much the rhetorical structure of not this, not that, how much they resemble each other, it's more clear what Blufstein is trying to say vis-a-vis Bialik and vis-a-vis poetry in general, and what her role or possibility for poetry is in that field. Did you want to ask something?
No, sorry.
Yes, Jeff. This would have been when he was pretty young. So he was either still in yeshiva or he was in Odessa. He's probably still in yeshiva at this point, just moving out. I should go check that. Why do you ask?
I guess I'm just wondering what would move him even to be conceptualized. Because I don't know a great deal about Bialik. I know who he is, of course. But, and I'm just wondering what would move him, how he would even be in a position of conceptualizing what it would be like to be living in the land.
Actually, he does make a trip to Palestine in the 1890s, although I don't know whether it was before this poem or after. But, he positions as his first poem, El Hatzipor, the bird comes and he welcomes the bird, and that's as if his only connection. But of course, there was modern communication, not postmodern communication, but modern communication of newspapers and people coming back and forth, and so he had a very good idea of what was going on, even if he hadn't at that moment seen it with his very own eyes. I can't remember if he went in 1897 maybe, or earlier. So he would have had some ideas and pictures of what was going on there from that. But he does spend most of the time actually talking about how much he wants to be there. There aren't so many images, even in the poem To the Bird, where he says, he questions the bird, what's going on in the Galilee, what's going on here. He just kind of marks the space, and then goes right back to talking about himself and how much he would love to do that or be there. So it's amazing how little you need to know about your object of desire if it's far enough away. Yeah, that's when these. I think I don't have the full details of his biography at my fingertips, but that's the phenomenon of it happening there, or even the kind of access to Hebrew texts at all that Bialik had. Right, and of course this is part of the reason why there's an assumption, and in some way, there's truth to this assumption that women had less access to these texts than men did. So, it makes sense that Blufstein doesn't refer to the Bible because, women learned it in translation, they learned Yiddish, they learned Jewish, in as much as they learned Jewish texts, they learned Sena Rena, exactly. So, there's a kind of a logic to that overpowering reading.
Was the Zionist thrust, was there already a push in the late 19th century to go to Israel to rebuild guilty to reclaim it. I mean, I know in the 20s it doesn't surprise me, but it just seems early to me.
Yeah, it is already happening. You mean in the kind of in the Yeah, I mean, he actually was from a pretty modest background, Bialik, which is not true of all the poets. And didn't have, for example, maybe, somewhat as opposed to Chernyakhovsky, who knew more foreign languages and had more of a formal secular education than Bialik did. But yeah, I mean, when he brings, so this is 1894. In 1892, I think he brings his first poem that I mentioned, El Hatzipor, to the bird, to Ravnitsky, to be published, and then it kind of moves around. Eventually it gets to be published in Pardes, a journal. So there are several journals where he could find a place to publish his poems, and had some contact with Achad Ha'am in the process of getting his poems, trying to get his poems published. So in a funny way, the yeshiva was for some people a hotbed of this. I mean, sometimes it was under the desk or behind closed doors, but that was a place where, for Bialik, was kind of a bigger place for him, more cosmopolitan than, where he was coming from initially, I would think. Yes?
You mentioned Gordon at the beginning of your lecture, and it just reminded me that I read a couple of letters that he wrote to Rachel Buchstein. And so it made me think, I was just wondering if there are other sources that you use other than the actual poems to know, for instance, what she thought about Bialik, or
what she thinks. Oh yeah, I mean, we don't have that much of her writing, and I mean, we have letters of hers, and mostly letters, and we have these short essays that she wrote, actually sometimes under a pen name, under a different pen name, so people didn't know it was Rachel. Yeah, I mean, I guess just off the top of my head, she writes about. I mentioned, I think, in my talk that she, how she also saw this category. She saw that, and she knew that she wrote very differently than Yocheved Bat Miryam, and that Elisha Bichovsky, maybe her poetry she didn't respect so much, etc., and that they didn't necessarily have, or Esther Rab wrote very differently. But she also saw them as a group, and she writes a letter to her friend, Sarah Milstein, and after Yocheved Bat Miryam comes to Palestine, and they have a big party, like a feting of her arrival, and she writes a letter. In the letter she says, it was a great party, we were celebrating, and there were, some 30 writers and artists there, and then she says, so-and-so played the piano, and the poetesses, but Misholot, right, so the poets, but the women, all 4 of them read from their poetry. So she's seeing them as a group, and then she says, Yocheved Bat Miryam, she's as beautiful as the tents of Kedar. She's got this exotic beauty of the Bible. But listening to her with her terrible Ashkenazic accent is torture. And a few years later, she writes this poem, actually not a very good, not one of her best poems, I would say, but a poem dedicated to Yocheved Bat Miryam, where she kind of gazes at Ani mabetet bach nif'emet nidmeh hine za'ach bechen ktumim bishchor v'lahat al tamin hatanach. So I look at you, I gaze at you, in wonder. It seems that just right before my eyes, with the charm of ancient times, with the blackness and the light, you've risen up from the Bible. And then she talks about how through you, and that comes back to, the postcard at the beginning of this talk, for her there were certain, and she's reflecting Hebrew culture. I mean, she really had her finger on the pulse, of the yeshiva, of the settlement. And for her, and that means, I think, that there's some truth to this in terms of what was actually going on in the settlement, there were very certain particular ways that women would be able to have a voice in the literary context. And one of those, and so some of those I've kind of outlined in these poems, but another way was through this notion of authenticity, which actually also comes through in these poems. And if you think of her poem Rachel, about her body being somehow connected mystically with the body of Rachel the matriarch, that's along the same lines, that if women were going to be poets, they, in a sense, from her perspective and from the perspective of the settlement of Hebrew culture at this time, they kind of had to be more muses than artists. So Yocheved Miryam, she's just has the right look for this role of being that authentic muse who's speaking from the ancient past and who's really authentic. And then she ruins it by demonstrating through her way of speaking that she comes from Eastern Europe. And I think if you think about trying to imagine Rachel, trying to imagine Bluestein dismissing Bialik because he has an Ashkenazic accent, I mean, it's very hard to imagine. So I think that's about, different expectations for men and women, and in a very pragmatic way. So this is the way that women's voices could be heard. There could be such a thing as women writing poetry if there is this idea of women's poetry.
I wonder, I'm just curious, why you're insisting calling her Bluestein instead of calling her Rachel, as she was canonized in Israeli culture?
I can't say I'm against her being called Rachel, because I think there's a perfectly historical justification for that, as you say, that Rachel is what she called herself as a poet. Rachel Mishoreret. So it's not that I necessarily think that's wrong, but part of what I'm trying to do is, kind of a reaction to what I was describing in the beginning of the talk, reading this criticism, this is who she is, this is what her poetry is, and then finding that there's a disconnect to some extent. I mean, there's truth in all these, there's some truth in all these myths, but there's a disconnect with what her poems are doing. So yes, she was responsible for this in part because I think because she felt that this was the way that women's poetry could exist, or that her poetry could be read, or would that was the limited way. But part of my project is to look at what else she was saying. Right? Because, yes, that's what she was saying on the surface for pragmatic reasons or for other reasons. But if we try to figure out what else is going on in the poem that's not as obvious to contemporary readers even, then we'll find out something about what was going on in literature, what being an author meant, for example. So, yes, I mean, I choose to use her patronym, which is, it's not, one could definitely debate that also. But it's a way, I think when even when I was showing something I wrote about this, and I cited some criticism which talked about her as Rachel, and I wrote it in English, Rachel, and, people are confused by that. And the truth is, when you call her Rachel all the time, when you call her Rachel all the time, it's harder to talk about her poetry in the kind of way that I want to. I suppose or not only seriously, but as separated from this persona that she developed of herself as, just speaking. I'm just saying a little something. It's not all that complicated, right? So it's true, I'm doing battle with her also, to some extent.
Well, you're putting her on the same playing field as Bialik. I mean, you don't say Henry or whatever his first name was, no idea. But, it's Bialik and Bluestein, right? I mean, and you are setting them up at the same place. Thank you so much.